Welcome to another webinar hosted by the Southeast Asia Program in the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. My name is Don Emerson. With my invaluable colleague, Lisa Lee, I administer the program. Today's event features Dr. Soksamphoas Im, who will explore how Cambodia's authoritarian government uses welfare policy to promote its legitimacy. Dr. Im is an affiliate of the University of Michigan's Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and she is our current Lee Kong Chan NUS Stanford Fellow on Southeast Asia, an annual fellowship that we allocate jointly with the National University of Singapore. Her project at Stanford is a book manuscript provisionally entitled Authoritarian Resiliency, the Politics of Social Protection Policy in Cambodia. She has published widely on Cambodian topics and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. In her opening remarks, Dr. Im will provide relevant background on the situation in Cambodia and summarize her core argument regarding welfare policy as a means to authoritarian legitimacy in that country. She may also briefly refer to comparable phenomena in other authoritarian states, such as China. Time permitting, I may ask Dr. Im a question or two of my own before opening the Q&A, when I hope you will pose your questions in writing via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Samphoas, the electronic floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Emerson, for introducing me to our audience today. And thank you very much to everyone for tuning in to our webinar today. So without further ado, I'm going to start, and allow me to share my screen. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. In today's webinar, I'm going to discuss how Cambodia's authoritarian regime co-opted welfare policy as an instrument to promote their legitimacy. But before I delve into this topic, I would like to share briefly of how I became interested in the topic and the background of Cambodia's contemporary politics. Then I will examine how the Cambodian government, under Prime Minister Hun Sen's leadership, managed to enforce significant changes after a contested election in 2013 by bringing in competent technocrats to lead a concrete reform and taking great leadership in campaigning and removing all forms of threat to his power. So a little bit about the motivation. I became interested in this topic because the decade of 2013 and 2023 was a major turning point in Cambodia's modern days politics. And I have myself also lived and experienced in this changing process. And this decade has also marked the time that the millennial generation, like myself, became eligible to vote and growing access to information through internet and smartphones in Cambodia. It was also the first time in Cambodia recent history to see two strong opposition parties, which I will explain later, merge together to compete in the election with the ruling party, the Cambodian People's Party, which created a hopeful promise for a change in leadership in Cambodia. And I also should note that it was also right after the world witnessed Myanmar's transition from a junta to a civilian government through the election in 2010 and 11, that also gave inspiration to many Cambodian people who were hoping to see a change in leadership in Cambodia. So this is here are the key points that I'm going to cover today, starting with the contested election in 2013 and where the ruling party's commitment to deepen reform, eliminate power threats, implement welfare programs, and ensure the functioning of welfare during COVID-19 pandemic. I will end this presentation with a discussion of how welfare reform contributed to promoting the legitimacy of the Cambodian's authoritarian regime. And so here's a primer of Cambodia's politics within the last decade. As you can see here on the slide, the recent decade that I mentioned from 2013 to 2023 was the decade that shaped Cambodia's politics today. And it has turned from a semi-democratic country into a complete patrimonial authoritarian regime. And I will stress a lot on the 2013 election because that, as I said, it's a turning point, and it was the last year that Cambodia really experienced a competitive election where the main opposition party was allowed to participate in the election fairly. However, the outcome of 2013 election has changed the political landscape in Cambodia as the ruling Cambodian People's Party has shifted its strategy to maintain full control of Cambodia by dismantling the opposition party and co-opting economic development and population policies with their coercive capacity. So moving on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that election in 2013 before moving on to the reform. So to understand how welfare why I said that welfare have to promote the authoritarian regime in Cambodia today, it is important to go back to where it all began, which was 10 years ago. The general election in 2013 was a significant one in 1993 when election that was organized by the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, which resulted in a coalition government led by the Cambodian People's Party and the Royalist Party called Hun Sen. However, Hun Sen was overthrown in 1997, and the CPP took full control of the Cambodia since then. And after 2 decades of under Cambodian People's Party leadership, a majority of the Cambodian population, especially the working class and middle classes, were fed up with the slow reforms, the high-stake corruptions, the human rights abuses, and they were ready for a change. And as Cambodia prepared for 2013 general election, 2 main oppositions in the country, the Sovereignty Party, which is the party with this candle lights, and the Human Rights Party, the green one, both parties led by 2 well-educated pro-Western Cambodian with liberal democratic mindset, merged together and formed a coalition opposition party in July 2012 and established this opposition party called the Cambodian National Rescue Party and inter-race with the ruling Cambodian People's Party, which is this one represented by this angel logo. So little did the confident, long-ruling Cambodian People's Party anticipate that the newly merged CNRP would be taking nearly half of the seats in the parliament that they have controlled for over 2 decades. As you can see here, the blue dot is the newly merged opposition party seats that they won, and the orange dot is the CPP. So, and the outcome also was very close to the it was a very close election outcome. So between the close outcome between the 2 parties led to month-long mass protests by the Cambodian National Rescue Party supporters, most of whom were working class people such as garment factory workers, informal sector workers, and the poor, demanding that the election for re-election, as they did not accept the election result that was probed with irregularities and also fraudulent. In solidarity with the supporters, the CNRP opposition party boycotted the parliament and refused to form a new government with the Cambodian People's Party. The Cambodian People's Party, led by Prime Minister Hun Sen, of course, actually dismissed the claim and demand of the opposition, and did not agree to reorganize the election. And instead, his party redistributed the CNRP seats to other small parties to form the government. And since then, they still control the majority of the seat, which was 68 out of 123 seats in the parliament. So after successfully forming a new government, it was time to learn from the mistake and reconfigure new strategies. The mistake that they did not expect the newly merged opposition party to take to nearly overtake their power. So in one of his public speeches in September 2013, right after 2 months after the election, Prime Minister Hun Sen told his official to take a bath, clean your body, and look in the mirror to see your face clearly in order to avoid doing something that affects people's interests or feelings. A statement that Pai Sipan, the Cambodian Council Minister spokesman, referred to as we learn from the people, we learn from this campaign to push very quickly for social justice to provide better justice to the people. Basically meaning to say the CPP, it's time for the Cambodian People's Party to start focusing on providing better care to the mass population, mainly the working class and the poor, or the CPP would run the risk of having their power challenged by the opposition force. It was also echoed by the CPP government spokesman Soksamphoas that 2013 election was a big lesson learned for them. So CPP's the close election outcome in 2013 was found to due to the lack of CPP's lack of reform to promote promote good governance was the main issue that led to the loss of their popularity and also trust among many Cambodians, especially the working class and the poor people. And so whereas CNRP, despite being a newly established opposition and severely lacking in resources, has benefited greatly from the demographic changes of the young citizenry. In 2012, 70% of Cambodians eligible voters were under 35 years old. And these young voters didn't just vote for the CNRP, but also fiercely mobilized public support for the opposition. They were very vocal about politics and governance, both in public and also on social media, such as Facebook or YouTube. These young voters wanted to see the CNRP elected to power so that some of its policy could be implemented, such for the benefit of the Cambodia's ordinary people, especially the poor and the working class. But they also want the process of change to happen without endangering peace and stability in the country, and without affecting everyday life in Cambodia. So with such momentous support from the younger Cambodian, the CNRP's successful election outcome was tied to their populist 7-point campaign policy, which I also put here on the slide, that aim at promoting the welfare of Cambodia's poor, vulnerable, and elderly population, and increasing minimum wage for factory workers and civil servants. The CNRP 7-point policy gave important hints to the CPP as they reconfigure their strategy and design reform policies. The CPP's leader commitment to reform was as strong as ever for the aging CPP officials to remake and rebrand themselves to appeal to the young voters in the next election on a scale that they had never managed before. As former Prime Minister Hun Sen said in one of his speech to post-2013 election, reforms are the top priority for Cambodia, and the country will continue to deepen reform in all fields in order to increase competition, sustain economic growth, and reduce poverty. He also said that deep reform will be focused on legal, judicial reform, anti-corruption, good governance, and land and forest management. So, learning from the mistake, they were very serious about reform, taking reform this time. So within 1 year post-2013 election, the CPP government shifted its shape significantly to convince people that they really mean it this time. Well-educated and competent technocrats were appointed to replace the older and least educated ones. halfway to the 2018 general election, the ruling CPP instituted a number of major reforms, and at least half of the opposition popular 7-point policy campaign platform was implemented by the CPP government. The central focus of the reform was mainly increasing salaries and providing direct handouts and basic needs service to the poor, such as cash assistance and free healthcare, which are the CNRP first, second, third, and fifth of the 7-point policy. So 4 of the 7-point policies were implemented before the 2018 general election. And other CNRP's reform pledge, such as other reform pledged by the CNRP, such as independent judiciary or public services or respect for human rights, were completely disregarded by the CPP government. So after taking cues from the CNRP popular campaign policy, former Prime Minister Hun Sen pledged to reform the administration and promote better governance by increasing the minimum wages for the government sector from $80 in 2013 to $140 in 2014, and then to $250 and civil servant to $250 per month at the start of 2018, just in time for the new election. In addition to the promise of salary increases, the CPP government also needed to seriously restructure its governance by providing a more equal distribution of patronage and economic fruits of the poorest segment of society. Such redistribution of economic growth would likely be to improve the livelihood of people, either directly or tangibly. A quote by Astrid Nilsson commented in 2017. And she also said that the CNRP disposal of new financial levers will lead to an increase in competition in populist policy between CPP and CNRP. And this was just before the CNRP was dissolved by the CPP government. And while making efforts to deepen the reform, the CPP also maintained its coercive capacity against any critical voices or groups that are perceived as threats to its power. For example, after assuming full control of the government post-2013 election, all protests across the country to demand fair election and justice were cracked down by the CPP forces. And besides smashing down the protests, CNRP opposition leaders were charged with treason, arrested, or forced exile, and banned from entering Cambodia. A prominent political analyst and critique of CPP government and beloved by millions of Cambodians, such as this guy, was assassinated in broad daylight in July 2016. And other free media, such as the Cambodia Daily, Radio Free Asia, and VOD, were shut down one after another during this decade. And along with that, the CPP government also increased civilian in the local community by establishing a pseudo paramilitary group in the village under the name People's Safety Guards. And this group may act like the village safety guards, but they also collect any information from the local community that is perceived as a threat to the CPP and report it to the top authority. So as I mentioned earlier, with the cues from the CNRP and from the CNRP's popular platform, the CPP government has implemented at least half of their populist policy that the CNRP pledged in 2013. And the key reform policies that were implemented, as highlighted here on the slides in this table. I made this table. So these are the policy that they took the cues from the CNRP. Some of them were popular, some are not, such as this one. In the name of judicial reform, they instead introduced new repressive laws, such as union law, laws on NGOs, and internet gateway law, and law on political party, etc. And these laws actually were the law that led to the the dissolve of the opposition party, and also arrested many activists, and increased scrutiny on civil society and unions, and led to the downfall of the free media in Cambodia, as mentioned in previous slide. So among all the key reform policy, I choose to focus mainly on the minimum wage increase and social protection on here, mainly because those are the policy were the most visible and actually highly achieved as a visible reform by the CPP government. So since 2014, the government sector has had minimum wage increase from $80 per month to $140 in 2014, $170 in 2017, and $204 in 2023. So basically, they try to increase salary for the people the year before the election, the general election happened. And in 2016, the Cambodian government launched this National Social Protection Policy Framework, which led to a huge expansion of welfare for workers, like factory workers and the poor and vulnerable population. And under the umbrella of the social protection policy, the Cambodian government expanded the existing social security fund by expanding the pension program to also cover private sector employees. And I heard recently they also will cover informal sector workers. And more importantly, the social protection policy, the most visible one of the social protection policy is the expansion of the social assistance program, which is known as the identification of poor household program to provide direct cash assistance and free healthcare to the poor and vulnerable population. Vulnerable, I mean women, like pregnant women, children, small children, and disabled people. And according to the data I found, to date, about 6 million Cambodians in total have benefited from the reform welfare program, both through social security and social assistance, either directly or tangibly. I said tangibly, mainly because programs such as the COVID-19 emergency cash assistance was only given temporarily during the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. So the core focus of my study is actually the identification of poorest household under the social protection policy, which I mentioned earlier, because it is the most popular welfare program in the country and has received much attention and support from many international organizations and foreign government agencies in the country. And the IDPO program is not, however, the IDPO program is not universal or permanent. It is a selective and also temporary, but more like long-term temporary welfare program provided only for the poor and vulnerable population, identified and selected based on a set of questionnaire and checklist by local working group or village or commune chief. And this is their process of how they identify people in the village to receive that social assistance, ID poor social assistance. So the working group and village and commune chiefs must maintain up-to-date data of ID poor card holders in their areas and amend or withdraw the ID poor card holders' economic condition if their economic condition has improved beyond the threshold. For example, if an ID poor card household economic situation has improved from, such as they found income, new job with income source, or they're able to build a better house, then the working group or the commune or village chief will withdraw the ID poor card from them based on whatever they see as visible possession as economic improvement. So the welfare program, especially the flagship ID Poor, was highly praised and received huge financial and technical support from many international organizations and foreign government agencies represented in Cambodia, such as the German Development Agency, Australian government, the EU, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, ILO, UNDP, UNICEF, Oxfam, etc. And those are among the organizations that have provided both financial and technical support to the Cambodian government in strengthening its social protection. For example, in 2021, the Asian Development Bank has approved $250 million to support Cambodia's COVID-19 response by strengthening the country's healthcare system and increasing social assistance to the poor and vulnerable, and providing economic stimulus to impacted business and workers. The lauded support from these international organizations and foreign development agency can be argued as a result of the Cambodian government's commitment to implementing the UN's SDGs and strengthening socioeconomic right in the country. Cambodia's social assistance program resonate with at least 5 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, such as poverty alleviation, ending hunger, promoting better healthcare, promoting access to education, and reducing economic inequality. So, and I will explain later why this. So as the UNDP representative in Cambodia commented, said UNDP support for ID Poor program is in the line with its conviction that social protection is an investment in people rather than a mere cost. And so what does welfare, but what does such an outpouring of support from these international organizations and foreign government agency means in Cambodia domestically and politically? So the CPP government's effort to deepen reform to improve the welfare of the Cambodian people after the 2013 election not only achieved international support and endorsement, but has also achieved domestic recognition and support, particularly from those who benefited from this welfare. In this study, I therefore argue that the CPP government has co-opted the ID Poor program as a populist policy to promote and strengthen its ruling power through both domestic support and international support. So, and based on my research, I found that the ID Poor program has provided at least 3 key contributions to promote CPP government legitimacy. One of those is that it has touted domestic support from the majority of the population, mainly the poor and the working class, as they were the one who benefited directly from the minimum wages increase and welfare assistance. And majority of these beneficiaries, they are eligible voters, so it helps to mobilize for election as well, as election itself still an important tool for the CPP government to maintain its legitimacy to facilitate the flow of aid, trade, and also maintain their diplomatic relations. So, another contribution was the setting the institution. The welfare reform actually led to the establishment and expansion of several welfare institutions within the government, including ID Poor Department, the National Social Protection Council, and National Social Security Fund Department. These institutions play an important role in ensuring that the functioning of reform welfare program, even during the economic downturn, such as COVID-19 pandemic. And the functioning of welfare for citizens, especially those who were severely impacted by COVID-19, such as garment factory workers, tourism worker, and the poor, was critical in preventing any mass protests or any social unrest caused by economic hardships that could, of course, lead to instability of the regime. And especially as CPP was, Prime Minister Hun Sen was prepared to transfer power to his eldest son, Hun Manet. So prior to the 2013 election, small gift handouts such as what I put here in this picture include a cash gift of anywhere from $2.50 to $5, a scarf or a sarong, like a traditional skirt, were a common gift given to the poor or factory workers or civil servants when attending the government's public event or election campaigns. However, the one-time gift handout was proven ineffective as people were fed up with the corruption and lack of reform and were ready for a change for better government, and that could provide them a more systematic support such as welfare. So learning from this past mistake and with cues from the opposition, the CPP's effort to deepen reform more systematically has proven to be more effective and receive more support from the population. As this one ID poor recipient said, she said, I'm still paying back a loan from when I get bad typhoid. This money means I can repay and afford food. We never had like this before. It is so reassuring. So the system of support, more systematic support such as welfare by giving them a card and them getting withdrawing money from cash transfers then monthly to many of these poor people is to them it sounds like especially as many have never had any formal job or with a salary or anything, to them getting $50 or $40 a month seems like a monthly income or salary for them, at least that they can look forward to. And I actually found from my study that a large majority of the ID poor beneficiaries were actually shown positive approval of the ID poor program and also expression toward the government. So as you can see here, 50% and also 50% of the people interviewed said that since they have ID poor program, their household economic condition has improved. 13% said it's moderately improved and 30% said greatly improved, and only 8% said not much improvement. So overall, this number constitute a large majority approval rate, at least in terms of economic improvement. But I also asked them question about how they feel toward the government for giving such assistance. And among those who said whether it's greatly or slightly improved, 80% of the ID poor program beneficiary who participated in my study actually expressed positive feelings and approval toward the government's welfare policy action, especially with this direct cash assistance. As one ID poor recipient that I interviewed said, I'm very happy about this support and grateful to the government for helping us. I'll continue to support the current government. Another one from a different village and different province said a very similar statement. I'm happy and I feel thankful to the government for this support, even though it's small, but it's consistent, and I'll continue to support the current government. So I found what's striking to me was that I found that many that were not hesitant to show that, especially this among these ID poor recipients, that they were not hesitant to show their grateful expression to the government and say that they'll keep, like in a way, like keep voting for the current government. So it's in this way, it seems that the ID poor cash assistance have proven much more effective than the one-time gift, such as during before 2013, such as a small cash gift or a SCAF giving to them. So in contrast, though, to the ID poor participant, only a small percentage of the tourism worker who received the pandemic cash assistance have given approval rating to the government of welfare policy action, especially toward the emergency cash assistance. Among those I interviewed in 2022, I actually interviewed 79 tourism workers in 2022 who received monthly cash assistance $40 per month, but only temporarily for only during pandemic. Said that while they appreciated the temporary cash assistance during crisis, many think that it's the government responsibility, and they think that the government could have done more to prevent the exogenous economic shock for workers like them. For example, raising and regulating minimum wage, improving labor structure standard in tourism sector, and forcing loan and repayment moratorium with microcredits and private banks. So the tourism worker, and why I show this data in contrast is that the tourism worker were considered before COVID hit the industry. Many of them were more of a middle class people. Many are well educated, and they have a better salary than people who work like in industry like garment sector. So for them, getting something like $40 per month during economic crisis like COVID-19, they don't see that as something that's extraordinary from the government. They think it's the government responsibility. So it's a contrast from people like the ID poor card people. Despite the small approval from the tourism worker, factory workers who were considered, most of them are less educated and they receive less salary before, or earn less than tourism worker before COVID-19. But they also benefited more from the increased minimum wage and the social security coverage, as well as temporary cash assistance during COVID-19. Were more appreciative of the CPP government's welfare policy action than those other tourism worker. As this one garment factory worker said, under Hun Sen, it's better, we have more benefit than before, said a factory worker clutching on to an envelope that she said contained $200 because she's pregnant, because the government has also have this policy given additional benefit to pregnant women, especially those are factory worker. I also must note that it's important to know the difference between tourism and garment factory workers, why the CPP government pay more attention to the garment sector workers. Garment factory workers make up the majority of the working class in Cambodia, and they have a very strong union representation and civil society alliance, and more than those in the tourism sector. And thousands of factory workers have joined mass protests after 2013 election, which has also led to violent repression. Therefore, it is critical for CPP government to ensure that the welfare of factory workers to the best they can, or they risk having to deal with any large-scale protests and violent repression again. So almost coming to that. So based on my research finding, the CPP government has effectively co-opted welfare policy with its coercive strategy to establish its legitimacy. The CPP government's effort to deepen reform within the last decade by focusing on improving the welfare for the poor, the vulnerable, and the working people has significantly improved the image of the government compared to the decade prior. While CPP may not win the heart of middle-class Cambodians, they won the heart of millions of poor and vulnerable and the lower working class Cambodian, and some government officials also through their modest cash assistance, social security, and increased minimum wage, and also through development partners such as those Western government like the Australian Development Agency, the German one, have praised the government for the effort to provide better care for the population. So, but how did welfare promote the image of the legitimacy or of the CPP long-ruling regime? The CPP's deep policy reform within the last decade has not only boosted the economic growth, but also promoted the welfare of the population. The expansive and popular population policies, such as the increased minimum wage and direct assistance, have enabled Prime Minister Hun Sen to claim credit and take pride in his ability to enforce change, as he pledged in 2013. And also, as he said in one of his public speeches, the minimum wages for factory workers and civil servants had more than doubled since the last election. And this is, as he said, the dividend of the CPP's ability to secure peace and stability. Despite the success of the ID pool and applaud from stakeholders, Prime Minister Hun Sen also has warned the public as his government expand the cash assistance during COVID-19 that the stimulus package is for helping the poor who are being affected by the pandemic, but we need to avoid creating a habit in which people become reliant on the government. And the cash assistance is only to make sure that no one starved to death. So basically, he knows that the welfare is important, but he also does know the consequence that of having cash assistance or having more people relying on the government for help. It is clear that despite the need to maintain the support base with the mass population, and the CPP government also does not want the mass population to permanently depend on the government for assistance. The large welfare expenditure and increased number of people relying on the government could also negatively impact the government's ability to maintain the country's economic stability as well. So despite wanting people not to become reliant on the government, the CPP still need to uphold the popular support from the working class and the poor people to make up the largest constituency, especially as they prepare to regenerate power to their sons and daughters following the 2023 election. Soon after Hun Manet accession to power, he has continued his father's tour with factory workers and reminded the crowd of his father's legacy, which he credited with Cambodia's present development. During his public speeches after he took the office, he announced to the factory workers that his administration will continue, has two goals, and one of those is to maintain the achievement of the previous administration, and the second one is to expand those achievements. And these are following that public announcement, Prime Minister Hun Manet immediately launched population policy as the first and key policies that his administration set out to continue, implement, and expand. And this is the direct translation of this 6 population policies that the new administration put out. So those policies include providing free healthcare, free access to skills and vocational training, more cash assistance to the poor and vulnerable, expanding social protection to informal sector worker, providing financial support for farmers through subsidized loan, and establishing farmer association in every commune to provide assistance to farmers. Clearly, these are populist policy that set out to appeal to the mass population that have the mass constituencies that have maintained the CPP's legitimacy whether through election or through other support in ruling Cambodia for their foreseeable future. So here, given the evolving nature of Cambodia's contemporary politics, and the new administration just took office for 3 months and they're still planning out their policy, I will conclude my talk here for now. And so to sum it up, the 2013 election, general election, was a major turning point that shaped Cambodia's politics today, and it was as an effective patrimonial authoritarian regime. It has triggered the long-ruling CPP to redefine its strategy to maintain the continuity of its authoritarian regime, but also maintaining effective coercive capacity. The CPP leadership also strategically reformed key social economic policy that ultimately promote the image of its governance by expanding welfare for civil servant and working class and poor and vulnerable. The welfare program has facilitated endorsement and support from both the beneficiaries and international development partners, which result in promoting the legitimacy of the authoritarian regime in Cambodia. So I will leave it here and the Q&A sessions. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention.
Soksamphoas, that was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much.
It was not only was it fascinating, but it was delightful in an academic sense. I'm not talking about morality or, the goodness or badness of democracy or theoretical issues like that. But the evidence that you are offering indicates the limited scope, I guess one would put it that way, of the convictions that are likely to be favoring what we would normally call liberal democracy, freedom and those sorts of things, that it is possible with a material agenda. I mean, in the hierarchy of needs, after all, survival is the most important, right? Not only survival, but in this case, the improvement that is noticeable in the most abject members of the population who are really down at the bottom and very, very vulnerable, right? So, one might build on this evidence a kind of resounding, forgive me for, deviating from what one might think would be an automatic American position, but a resounding defense of the possibility that performance can not only legitimate an authoritarian government, but illustrates the extreme limits of freedom of speech and freedom of access and freedom and so forth, right, of individual behavior, that although these things are, part of the Enlightenment, which was, of course, obviously a Western experience historically, that these are really quite limited. And it shakes up a lot of assumptions that, speaking as an American, I think a lot of my co-Americans here in the United States. Anyway, all right, I won't pursue that further, but it's just a striking kind of reaction. I do want to ask a question.
Okay.
I guess the question is an effort to try to give us an alternative or a kind of, it's a dialectic here, right? So if I may look for a little bit of an antithesis to respond to your your thesis, let me just say a couple of things. First of all, of the 100, as you know, of the 180 countries covered in the 2022 Corruption Perceptions Index, 29 of those countries, only 29, a small fraction, are seen as more corrupt than Cambodia. So I take it from your presentation that corruption, I'm not talking about perceived corruption from outside of Cambodia. I'm talking about corruption as it is perceived by the recipients of this welfare. Now, maybe I can easily imagine an argument that says, well, who cares about corruption? I care about the result, right? If I'm getting a cash transfer, no problem. I go ahead, be corrupt as long as I can benefit, right?
Right.
And the second thing that I don't know how you would counter that argument if you even wish to counter it, but the second thing I would argue is this. We're looking from the sort of the beginning without necessarily following through the process to the end. And what I mean by that is, if the beginning is massive welfare subsidization, and of course, then there's a question as to whether or not the Cambodian economy will continue to allow for this kind of massive expenditure. That's, I suppose, a separate question. But then, where is the ultimate payoff in terms of the legitimacy? Does the legitimacy mean that the CPP, here's the question. Let's imagine that an utterly free and fair and democratic election were to take place in Cambodia, later this year, and people would simply vote freely without any, repression or, anything like that. Do you think that on the basis of the legitimation of authoritarian rule that you have described, or the argument that you have presented, that actually, Hun Manet and the CPP would win, despite the fact that they are corrupt and authoritarian?
Right.
So that's the opening question, and then we'll open it to questions from the audience. We do have a couple of questions.
So thank you so much for your comment and question. So if I may repeat your questions again, it's so if there were to be a free and fair election, you think that the CPP would win still because of the what the people applaud them for what they have done in the last 10 years?
Right.
Like, yeah, you kind of answered the question already, the way that how, despite being a corrupt country with only 29 countries below Cambodia, the Cambodian people, especially the middle class, is still very small, to be honest,
Right.
than
Right.
the
Yeah.
working class and the poor. So the obviously the popular support from the least educated and the poor is still what determine the result of CPP's election outcome or their legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, having like least educated and least middle class people,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to their repressive capacity.
Right. Yeah. So in other words, you're more or less agreeing with the conclusion that in this case, Hun Sen and now Hun Manet, assuming that he follows his father's footsteps,
Right.
have achieved an effective formula for massive tolerance, more than tolerance, legitimation of authoritarian rule in Cambodia. Right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
It is also tied to the Cambodia history, recent history of the conflict and the Khmer Rouge conflict, and that a lot of the Khmer Rouge conflict survivors are still there. Like about 7 million people survived Khmer Rouge, and they are still eligible voters, and a lot of them, they are still traumatized by the war, and so for them, peace is very important. So that's why the current Cambodian government is also using the strategy to more like they can read the Khmer Rouge survivor will definitely choose peace beyond corruption or economic for now because of what they have experienced in the past.
Yeah, so that actually introduces a slightly different argument, namely that it's the stability, it's the peace, given the uniquely bloody background, historically, that actually makes it difficult. You know, I'm trying to rescue liberal democracy, I guess. I don't know. That it makes it difficult for us to infer from your argument about Cambodia the more general sense that, well, you know, democracy is irrelevant. You just gotta give people money and they'll be yours, right? Because stability obviously matters tremendously in a country that suffered so grievously as the Cambodian people have suffered. I think that's a great big fat footnote. It's more than a footnote, really. All right. Okay.
So that's why it's Cambodia have never. I mean, it's difficult to try to achieve the liberal democracy in Cambodia given its history, given the context of the people in Cambodia today. Maybe in the future, next generation who didn't experience war.
Right. Oh, fair enough. Okay, now let's go to the to the audience here. Eric White wants to ask the following question: to what degree, if at all, has populist welfare reform and provisioning in neighboring countries, such as Thailand, for example, served to inform or guide CPP policy when designing or rolling out its welfare policies? In other words, populist welfare reform is something you learn from the neighbors. I mean, I'm simplifying it, but
okay, yeah. Thank you so much for your question. That is very, very relevant question, and I'm actually also looking at some literature about populist policy, the way populist policy works in Thailand too, like during Thaksin. because Thaksin has actually implemented very effective populist policy, especially in the among the rural population. And until today, the Phugthai or led Thaksin's party is still popular among the rural people, poor people and farmer people, because they are getting that cash assistance, and including the current government now giving a direct handout to farmers in Thailand. So I think I don't know because I have not done enough research in Thailand. I've only read some literature. I am sure that neighboring countries such as Thailand and with Prime Minister Hun Sen also have a very close ally with Thai former Prime Minister Thaksin. I am sure that he has also taken the cues from the neighbor friend as well to build his reform policy, because there are so many features in Cambodia welfare policy that actually very similar to that in Thailand. For example, even with the new administration in Cambodia under Hun Manet, they already put policy as helping farmers in Cambodia, giving subsidized loans and providing more support to the farmer. That's very, very similar to the one in Thailand.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Judy Ledgerwood asks a basic question, a mathematical question, I suppose you could say. What percentage of the population receive the welfare benefits that you describe? Is the program nationwide, even in ethnic minority areas?
Okay, should I answer now, or is there any?
Yes.
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, from the data that I found today, there are 6 million Cambodian have benefited from the cash assistance, the ID Poor program, the Social Security, which out of 16 million Cambodian. So that's about 1/3, a little more than 1/3 of Cambodian people have received some benefit from these welfare reform policies. I also should note that the welfare program in Cambodia is not universal. It is still highly selective. Only certain people will benefit from it, particularly the social assistance.
I guess it follows from that to ask this question, and that is to say, 6 million out of 16 million, that's less than half. That's a fairly small percentage. And so the first question would be, what about the 10 million that don't get these benefits? Do they feel that they're well enough off without them? What kind of reaction do you think might be generated by all of those people who are not on the receiving end of this kind of assistance? So does that matter, do you think, looking forward?
So to answer that, the other 10 million, they are, I think, a majority of Cambodian population are also young population, like born in the 90s and 2000. So they're still very young, and they're not the people that's, think about the welfare just yet.
Okay.
So I do think that, but now they're also working on, the current administration is also working on expanding the welfare to the younger one too, by expanding like free program for younger population to enroll in, for example, like vocational training skill, where young people who want to pursue vocational training skill can go and pursue that program for free, and in addition getting a monthly stipend from the government, about I think $70 or something like that a month. So this is they're still working on expanding it. So of course the 6 million is the data I got from in 2021, and that was during COVID. So, and this is, as I said, it's policy that evolving expansion. So I am sure they try to reach as many people as possible, especially those who are eligible voters.
Thank you. Yunan An has an interesting question, which I will paraphrase. Namely, the assumption, the implicit assumption, it seems to me, in our conversation so far has been that the Cambodian government is engaged in this activity for domestic reasons, for the legitimacy of the regime in the eyes of Cambodians. Now, what about an alternative, maybe complementary, not necessarily alternative, hypothesis, which says actually, especially given the involvement of the European Union, and all of these outside organizations, international organizations, that actually a major motivation behind what the Cambodian government is doing is to try to receive the accolades from the international community.
Right.
To increase the legitimacy of Cambodia in the eyes of the outside world. What do you think of that hypothesis?
I think, like I mentioned in the presentation, they don't want to just only receive legitimacy or like be legitimized by the people, Cambodian people, but they also needs to feel that their government is capable and legitimized by the international community as well through this international organization. So sorry, I maybe I didn't get the whole question. If you may summarize.
Well, no, the idea is, look, you're running a country, right? And so the people who live in the country obviously are of major concern to you. I mean, presumably in some sense. And the idea here is that Cambodia wishes to elevate its legitimacy on the international stage.
Right.
Which is not in contradiction to the desire to do that domestically, but it's just the addition of a kind of diplomatic motivation, one might say.
Right.
So unless you want to say something really briefly in answer to that, let's move on to the next question. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So Oren Samet would like to ask the following question, which is, well, actually, before I do that, let me go to Gidong Kim because it's in order here. I don't want to, jump the order. There are a number of questions here. So Gidong Kim would like to know, do you have any evidence that shows that welfare recipients have changed their party support, their vote, after getting benefits from the ID poor from the government? At least anecdotal evidence, although it would be even better to get statistical evidence. Or maybe we haven't had enough elections. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, it's a critical question because that is a causal proposition, right? In other words, that behavior would be very important to know in terms of your thesis.
Right. That is actually a very, like you said, a very important and critical question. And I have also been thinking about this as well. But I wish there are data available, and it's but we have not had election at all since 2013 to measure that change in people's behavior, because since 2013 we had two other elections, 2018 and 2023. People are being forced to go to vote,
right,
for party, like they don't have a choice. They have to go to vote, and whether they don't have any party to vote for. It's only the ruling party and other small parties that are actually allies to the government. It's not really an actual competition or an actual race. In other words, it's a one-horse race election in 2018 and 2023. So even if the people who supported the opposition in 2013, they might vote for the CPP because they didn't have other choice, and they could risk having consequences if they don't go to vote. So it's sort of like a situation where you're forced to pick.
The next question is also an excellent, really excellent question. I'm going to abbreviate it with apologies to Oren Samet, who is the source of the question. If the CPP is so popular based on these welfare policies, why does it continue to rely on repression and coercion and prevent any real opposition from running in national elections? Why isn't it confident enough to go ahead? Let's have a free election. You know, we're popular.
So that's also a great question. Even though they have this tool where they think it really helps them to legitimize, but the CPP is still insecure of themselves, especially among the middle class voter and the working class, like the factory worker or even the tourism worker. Like, for instance, in my presentation, they are basically worried that, like I said, they're still not very secure. It's only been 10 years since that happened, and the welfare policy has only been implemented mainly since 2016-17. So it's still very new. And also the CPP needed to maintain a full control of the government, because it's not just about maintaining authoritarian regime, but it's also about transferring power to their family, within their family. It's in other words, a patrimonial authoritarian regime. So without full control of all of the government, of all branches, say for example, they are entering a fair election where they allow opposition party and stuff like that. If they're really confident of them getting elected, even if they get elected, they wouldn't have the full control of the government to prepare for power transition, like what they just did 3 months ago.
Yeah. Right, exactly, which then opens up a whole nother discussion that we don't have time for, which is to say, what are the sort of standard risks of an authoritarian regime? And one of them, of course, is not that the populace will rise up and overthrow you, but that your colleagues, your authoritarian colleagues, whom you thought were your friends, are conniving against you, right?
Right.
And time and again, we get that story of uneasy lies the head that wears the crown, right? As we
right.
which I think is an important dimension to include in the conversation, right? Okay, this is from an anonymous attendee. Given the level of corruption, how do we know that all the ID poor really receive the cash? Is there reliable and verifiable evidence that they do?
So this is actually a very it has been an issue ever since they implement the ID poor program. There are actually a lot of issue, mainly corruption within the implementation process within the ID poor system itself, where community, like say a commune chief or village chief, giving the ID poor program to their family or their friends who are not really actually poor, because the government does not have a mechanism where they can do assessment to ensure that the cash assistance really given was to the people that really needed help. So actually in I read an article last year. They found that more than 40,000 ID poor card holder were actually not very poor people. They're people who actually have income, have good house to live. If some of them even have a car. Actually, when I was doing interview in the village, some ID poor people actually told me that, oh, I know this family in my neighbor, they're not poor, but they also have ID poor card. It's unfair, but what can we do about it? It's they are relative of the village chief, so they know about this. But the government also, like the Ministry of Interior, actually were informed about this too, and they have withdrawn some card, like ID poor card, from some of these households that does not deserve it. But the issue is still there. It's not fully assessed and also to ensure that, to prevent such kind of corruption. Yeah.
If I could insert a question of my own, we have not, to my knowledge, to my memory, used the word dependence. And any sort of welfare program that, shoots money down to the bottom of society, to some extent, one would argue, again, other things being equal, creates a certain dependency of that individual on the state. And perhaps one could go a little further and argue, depending upon the individual. I mean, if your poverty is so abject that you expect to die of starvation, then obviously that's a different calculation than the one that I have in mind. The one I have in mind is that the recipient of this largesse, of this welfare, becomes accustomed to it, and his dependence on the state leads to a situation in which the state finds that it cannot meet the obligation of maintaining that dependence over such a large portion of the population. And that it's the dependence on the state that is perhaps, the seed of dissent, depending upon the capacity of the state, of course, to meet the demands coming from the bottom of continued cash transfers and free medical care and so forth. Which again, I think in the background of that question, of course, is the issue of the Cambodian economy. Although I suppose if the international organizations are going to come in to provide a lot of support for cash transfers, then maybe the Cambodian economy doesn't have to carry quite the same burden. But I guess the question here is whether dependence is going to be, the wild card that will, shuffle the deck down the road, or not.
I mean, this is why obviously they do need this to have this in place, but they also aware of the repercussion of having the dependence on them too. That's why I remember attending this one meeting, and a government official actually mentioned that this meeting was to discussing on how to expand welfare program to include informal sector worker, and the one government official mentioned was like the goal of the government is not to become a welfare state, because they also acknowledged the current economic situation in Cambodia. I mean, Cambodian economy is still very much depending on foreign capitals, and also a lot of loans from foreign government, most particularly China. So having too many population depending on the government will cause a huge consequences for the countries and economy, like I mentioned, economic stability of the country too.
Yeah. The next question, again, I'm going to alter it just a little bit, if I may. Who determines who receives the assistance? Is it sort of neutral, not political, not related to who you happen to know, unconnected to corruption, so that there's a category? If you fit the category, maybe if you're working in tourism, you don't fit the category quite as well as somebody, who is lower down, on the food chain, right, and needs the money more in some sense. But is there a kind of uniform set of criteria that are applied nationwide, or, which seems a little bit unlikely given the rate of corruption, or are individuals deciding these matters, particularly in the rural areas, for example? Are there local officials in the rural areas that have the power to channel the money in one direction or another, which might then, I suppose, have some beneficial effect on the recipients, but on the other hand, would further implant corruption at the local level? How would you respond to that?
So in fact, the Ministry of Planning that oversee the program, like the ID Poor program, they have developed a preset questionnaire, like a checklist where the people will be identified as poor, and so for the way it works is like, so the village chief will nominate the poor family in their village, to the working group that the Ministry of Planning is overseeing. And these people will come to interview these poor people based on a set of questionnaire that they have developed to identify if this household qualified for that program or not. So that's the way they have designed how they identify which family or which household deserve the cash assistance. However, I mean, in theory, the way they designed us should work, but given the corruption, sometimes the working group is not the one who do the interview. It's the village chief or the commune chief in that area will do the interview on behalf of the working group and identify them, and then note it to the top authority to give them the card. And once they have the card, they can go and collect the money monthly.
Right. And I think we probably should come to a conclusion here. We're running out of questions. We've covered a lot of ground. But before we say goodbye, an anonymous attendee has posed, I think, a very interesting question. The kind of question that rarely shows up in Q&As, in webinars, in my experience. And here's the question. After the answers to the questions in the Q&A, the answers that we've all heard or are given, would the conclusions in the talk, namely on how effective these social policies are in maintaining or even improving the legitimacy of the authoritarian regime, would that conclusion still stand after the discussion we've had during the Q&A or not? That's a very pointed question. So I apologize, but precisely because it's very pointed, I think it's of interest, right?
Yes.
As you look back on it.
It certainly is. And to be honest, this is a project that is in development too. It's not completed. I just started this project, and it's also a project that is also synced to my dissertation and my other project that I did during my postdoc. So, and it's a larger project, obviously. So I still have to collect some more data to prove my argument. So, but I would like to say that I don't know how effective it is, but I would like to say that it certainly have a significant contribution to strengthen the CPP government legitimacy in a way that, like, especially compared to the decade prior to the 2013 election, where they really have made significant progress and really kept up to their commitment to reform. At least in this case, and Cambodia never had something like this welfare at all. I mean, before that, I mean, there are many factors why we never had welfare before that. But I would say, to sum it up, I would say that it has significant contribution to promote legitimacy. But how effective it is, I will answer that in my book.
Yeah, well, I can't resist closing the session with pardon me, I've probably spoken much too much during the conversation here, but with the following comment. Again, looking at this from the perspective of someone like myself who is interested in democracy, liberal democracy in particular, I think it would be fair to say that if we look back over the years, the decades, the centuries, right, all the way back to the Enlightenment, I suppose, a Western Enlightenment, not necessarily an Asian one, we realize that much of the rationale and discussion and focus and concentration in the discourse on democracy has been all about input, the freedom to vote, which is the beginning of the electoral process, not the end, right? Let alone the policy that a government elected democratically would then necessarily follow, and whether it would be a failed policy or a successful policy. the notion of performance legitimacy, I think creatively, certainly it's stimulating, cuts directly at the assumption that if you have human rights protected and freedom of speech is there, then you've solved the problem. Then there's no problem, right? There's democracy, go right ahead. Right. And of course, what the input emphasis ignores is the output, which can vary radically from country to country. Now, one possibility is to say, well, only authoritarian governments have bad output. The democratic governments, they have terrific output. But that doesn't make sense if you look at the record. It simply doesn't. Then there's the argument that authoritarian governments very often are successful performers. And the instance of China immediately is on the table. But if we look at the recent, I mean, this is off topic, I admit, but if we look at the recent last, year or so, maybe it's too recent for us to draw too many conclusions from it, but the so-called China miracle, right, of double-digit economic growth and all of that, we could explain that further, but we don't have time, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to be able to pursue that argument. But in any case, it seems to me undeniable that right now the performance indicators with regard to the Chinese economy, the PRC's economy, are not good. They're not encouraging, right? So yes, performance legitimacy is a concept and it's real. You can gain legitimacy through performance, but that doesn't mean that you don't have all kinds of other problems. And in particular, in the Chinese case, is there any guarantee that a year from now or 2 years from now, there will be simply passive, acceptance on the part of much of the population, even if China's economy does not follow the expected promise of dramatic economic growth and welfare for all. So I think, whatever you think about the arguments that have been put forward, it's very important, I think, to keep in mind that an old-fashioned input-based, discourse on democracy is certainly incomplete, very incomplete. And we have to recognize the concept of performance legitimacy, regardless of the identity of the performer. So I'm sorry I've talked so much, but listen, you've been terrific. I really appreciate you've been just absolutely wonderful. It has been an unmitigated pleasure having you at Stanford. I wish you the very best on all of your projects, the book and so forth. And I know that the audience would join me if we were sitting around a large table, we would be clapping, we would be applauding. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Emerson.
Yeah. And thank you to Lisa Lee, my invaluable.
And Lisa, of course.
Yes, without her, this would not have happened. Yeah. And thank you to all of you who have, who are still there taking part in this webinar. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Professor Emerson and Lisa, for this. And thank you to our audience for tuning in in our webinar today. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, take care.